nobody likes to read directions. There are safety warnings right on the nail gun. Most people don't realize that, but if you read the directions and follow the manufacturer's recommendations, their rules for using that gun, it makes it a much safer device.
Another thing that we did mention about the weight of the gun being about 8 pounds, but when you're working overhead, if you're ever nailing overhead, and a lot of times, most of the times, guys don't use this with 2 hands. They're just using it with one of their arms. And when they come back down again, that tool is heavy. They're tired from having it up in the air. And when they come back down, if their finger's on the trigger, if that work contact element just bumps against their leg or maybe another person standing behind them, sometimes guys have even gotten a nail shot through their skull this way. So always remember, if you are working overhead, when you start to lower your arm, take your finger off the trigger before you bring the gun down.
Even something as simple as, even though they're not supposed to, a lot of them do, carry a tool up a ladder. You got a guy right behind you. You got your finger on the trigger, you stand a real good chance of shooting the guy that's right behind you. So there's a lot of little safety aspects that you have to be aware of, even as far as this air release. Now, on the ones that I used to use, and I don't want to mention my age, but this used to be adjustable, where you could turn it in different directions depending on what you were shooting or how you were shooting it, so that that air exhaust would go away from you rather than in your face. I'll never forget the time when the first apprentice that was using that, the air release was right behind it, and every time he shot, he got a blast in his face from the air, and I had to tell him to turn it around so that it would blow away. But the sequential gun with the sequential trigger, which means you have to pull the trigger. I can't just go along with the trigger depressed and just bounce this thing along and shoot. Every time you shoot, you have to place the plunger where you want it, pull the trigger. Place the plunger where you want it, pull the trigger, or it doesn't go off. You get better placement of your nails, and the efficiency and productivity of using a sequential trigger as opposed to the bump gun is very minimal. There is very little difference between the two of them. Once you get the hang of using the sequential trigger, it is better for nail placement, and the productivity really doesn't amount to a hill of beans. The difference between the two of them is just very negligible.
The big difference is that most of our apprentices that get injured are being injured with the bump fire gun because they're firing them. First of all, they're not trained properly. On the job site, everything's run and gun all the time. And then they're using them so quickly, they're not really thinking about the placement of each nail. When you use a sequential trigger, you're thinking a little bit more, that fraction of a second, then you're thinking a little bit more about the placement of each nail, which does help cut down on those injuries.
And one other thing that I want to enforce upon you people as we go through this is the importance of always using the oil lubricant that is made for that particular gun. Read the directions on the back of the bottle. This takes 6 to 20 drops in this gun to keep it well lubricated because of the paper on the nails and because of the amount of nails that are pushed through there. The plunger and the mechanisms inside the firing pin will all dry out and they won't function properly. Your gun will have more tendency to jam. The other thing that I forgot to mention was when we got onto the compressor, the maintenance of the compressor at the end of the day. During hot and cold weather swings that we have here in this state, you have to allow for the condensation that builds up. There is a drain plug. First, you want to release the pressure from the tanks. Any excess pressure you can release from the tank. And then you want to get the drain plug, which is on this side, which I don't know if we can get it on camera. But we have a drain plug here. This drain plug will empty the tanks of all of the condensation that builds up in it. If you do not release this water that builds up in the tanks, two things happen. You lose volume in the tanks for your air, and the tanks have more of a tendency to rust out over a period of time. The lubrication from the gun through the air hose ends up in here. You want to make sure that water is drained out before you put this in the gang box. Any water that leaks out is not the best thing in the world. At the end of the day, you want to blow it off, wipe it off, so that because this is air cooled, if these vents get full of sawdust and debris, it will get a little warmer as it's being used and it will not be as efficient. Make sure everything's off. Leave this valve open for any excess drainage or anything that's going to be in there. Beginning of the day, that's the first thing you close back up. If you start it up and that's open, you'll notice it immediately because there'll be air escaping from it.
A lot of times on your guns itself, it will mention how many drops of oil to put in them in the morning. And you really should make sure that you do that. The contractor always likes to see that because he knows that you're taking care of his tools. And then depending on the use of the gun, sometimes you'll have to go ahead and put more oil in them after lunch if you're using them very heavily. So that's a very important part, is to always make sure that they're well lubricated. And you don't want to throw these things around like they're toys. You know, they're expensive, and you know, you're always thinking of how to keep your job and how to please the contractor and the guy that you're working for. So you make sure that you treat them with respect, and you know, they're not cheap. So place them down in position. Don't be throwing them or putting them in positions where they could fall or you know, get abused.
And the last point that we might want to bring up is never hoist the nail gun by the hose. Tie it off and hoist it up.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today in this talk about nail gun safety.
And always remember, these safety glasses and this hard hat are important when you're using power tools. Thanks for your time.